Hi, everyone. Welcome all. I'm Lucie Lalumière. I'm the president of Interactive Ontario. And today I am with Sarah Saucier and Stephanie Greenall, who are at IO as well, Interactive Ontario. And a bit of logistics, please ask your questions in the Zoom chat. We will check them, and Tyler will stop, maybe 4 times during his talk, and he'll be able to answer the questions. I see among us our supporters as well. I want to mention big thank you to Ontario Creates and the Canada Media Fund for supporting this event. So your support is key. Without you, we would not be able to organize such thought leadership events. So thank you. Tyler, I'm so pleased to have you with us. I've watched you talk at Canada Games Online. Your talk was incredibly invaluable. And in fact, we got a lot of positive comments about your thought because that data is critical to decision making. So I will introduce you formally. So Tyler is the head of game development and publishing at Newzoo. Prior to that, though, Tyler has a long experience in the game industry. Tyler has worked for the 9, 2K Games, and other studios. He has founded 2 development studios, and he started working at Newzoo this year in March. So Tyler is leveraging his experience, real life experience in game studios, in business development, operations, production, development, publishing, and he often engages with key stakeholders in the game industry worldwide to share Newzoo's unique insights and data analytics. So without further ado, welcome, Tyler, up to you.
Great, thanks. Nice to meet everyone, and thank you so much, Lucy, Stephanie, Sarah, everyone involved for inviting me. I'm super stoked to be here today. To be able to present a little bit. Today we're going to be talking, some bigger stuff. We're hoping to cover some of the larger trends and numbers in what's been going on in 2020. Obviously, I don't have to say that this has been a crazy year for everyone, and there has been a lot of interesting trends as well in the industry, as everyone knows. And we're hopefully going to be able to tackle some of those. And then a couple of key topics we want to hit towards the end is going to be related to COVID, the impact of that on the games industry and the market, and then also a little bit about next generation consoles, what's going on with those. We just got some data rolling in, so I'll hopefully be able to share a little bit of some snapshots of those, what's going on, what games are performing well, etc. So yeah, okay, I'm gonna try to share my screen now. All right, cool. Okay, so yeah, just a little bit of background about Newzoo. Hopefully everyone has heard of us, but we are one of the leading market and data analyst insight companies here in the games industry. What we really pride ourselves on is that we really try to take a 360-degree view of the market. We want to have data and analysis across the board, so we don't just specialize in one area, but we want to bring all the different sectors, all the different platforms, et cetera, all together to bring these, kind of like what we're talking about today, some of the highest level insights we can, and hopefully give everyone a kind of overview of what's going on in the market. But beyond that high level stuff, we also, just to give you a little sneak peek into our other services and products, I just wanted to mention that we do a lot of other things as well. We have our own, what we call a Newzoo platform. This is really our newest and we think our coolest new product in place. And this is really a single destination where we brought data tracking across all the different platforms, from PC to mobile to console, even viewership, Reddit, all kinds of stuff. We brought it all together, all this tracking into one platform to kind of give you that, what I was saying, that 360-degree view of the market. We also do consumer insights. We do a lot of consumer surveys. So we have the data tracking for the platform, and we also have a ton of survey data on the consumer side, so self-reported data. We have a couple products like that. We also do custom research and consulting. So if you're interested in any of these, of course, feel free to reach out to me. I would be happy to talk more about that. All right, so yeah, like I mentioned today, the key topics, broke it down into 4 separate sections. The first thing we're going to be talking about is just the overall key numbers. So what are the top numbers in the industry? What do we need to know that's happened this year? And then the second section will be diving more into the qualitative stuff, the trends, what's going on, what are the top trends this year, and what's been going on recently, and maybe talking a bit about what's coming up, hopefully. And then the third one, is the COVID impact. So like I mentioned, we're going to be looking into in terms of industry and then also the market itself. What are some of the larger impacts? What are maybe the potential long-term impacts of COVID-19? And then finally, like I mentioned, a little bit about the next-gen consoles as well. So, all right. So talking about the key numbers, we like to start off, the highest level numbers possible. The first one we always want to look at, we really care about engagement a lot, and just looking at the total number of players around the globe. We can see right off the bat, Asia Pacific, huge, over 50% of the market now is actually in Asia Pacific. We've seen really large growth there, about 5% year over year. But what's more interesting in terms of growth is that actually Latin America, Middle East, and Africa, we have about 7% in Latin America and 6% in Middle East. So these areas are smaller right now, but they are growing quite quickly, and we expect this growth to continue as more devices, for example, a lot more people are getting hardware for mobile devices and even into PC and console as well. Some of the slower growing ones, North America and Europe, most of the penetration's already there in terms of devices and such. We do see growth, and we have seen this year has had really good growth in overall global players because of one big reason, of course, is the COVID situation, quarantine. We are seeing a lot of growth around the board. I'll talk more about that later, of course. Looking into the forecasting going forward, as you can see from 2015, we've really seen pretty steady growth across the board. This is global, worldwide right now we're looking at. But yeah, what's interesting as well, we're looking at maybe over 3 billion players by 2023, which would be pretty awesome milestone. And other thing to note is on the right-hand side, you can see the breakdown per platform. So console players and PC players combined are still, less than the total mobile players. But of course, some of these players are obviously playing cross-platform as well. In terms of revenues then as well, if we break it down by region, we see that it's somewhat similar in terms of Asia Pacific. We see a little bit less than 50% coming from that region. But we see a really large bump, obviously, in North America and Europe, 30 billion in Europe and 45 billion in North America alone. What's really interesting, though, is really the year-over-year growth. This was really heavily impacted by the COVID-19. Our original forecast at the beginning of the year before that was, I believe, per region was less than 10%. But we're seeing a huge growth across the board. Obviously, we can see those certain regions are even performing even better than that. Again, Middle East, Latin America have had huge growth. Even before COVID, we saw that they were growing faster than the other regions, but really fantastic growth in both of these regions. But now even in Europe and North America, we originally projected a lot less growth, but now we're seeing pretty substantial growth this year. So quite interesting to see these numbers, that they're so large, to be honest. We all know that, I think most people know that the revenues have been going up, but to see that it's growing this fast is quite impressive. Another interesting note on the side there again is China plus US total is already almost 50% of the total revenue, which is pretty impressive itself. All right, and then diving into these numbers. So we're looking at the revenues, total revenues for the year, but broken down by platform. So we can see that mobile, again, is making almost 50% of the total revenue here. Again, huge growth. If we look at that, we're looking at over 25% growth year over year, so 86 billion. In terms of console and PC, those combined are almost the same as mobile now. So it's mobile has a very strong lead. But what's also interesting is the PC versus console growth this year. So again, when I was saying before COVID, what we saw was, I think our projections were about 10% growth in terms of console, and now we're seeing over 21%, or about 21% now. So we've seen that for some reason, the console space has seen an even stronger growth than something like PC. I think from what we've researched and looked into, a lot of it is A lot of even the current generation, so the PS4s, the Xbox One, and Switch, of course, have sold really well this year. So people were, even during that downtime, they were looking for quick entertainment. I think it was a great middle ground between mobile, which everyone has, but PC is the barrier to entry is a little bit higher. So console kind of fit that really sweet spot of accessible entertainment during these tough times. Some interesting little tidbits in there. You can see we're still looking at like browser gaming is dropped year over year. I think it's pretty obvious why that would be. Most people are going into more of like the mobile space from there. But even in mobile, it's kind of interesting is the tablet, even tablet games, which most people don't talk about much, but we even seen over 7% growth in that area as well. So tablet still has a decent little size in there. What's also interesting, I think, to note is the box versus download games. So for PC, to be honest, most of the sales are digital. I think it's over 90% of PC sales are digital, while console we see have about a 50-50 split. So about half of the sales are going to be boxed, and then half are downloaded as well. Cool. And then going back to the country level, so we're looking at, we mentioned that China and the US are the top two in terms of total revenue. By far, as we see on the far right-hand side on the revenues column. Interesting to note, I think, is that you can see all the top countries in here. We're all seeing North America, Western Europe, and Asia are all the top ones. So obviously there's a lot of countries in here that have a higher population, internet population, or even players, but in terms of revenue, this is the breakdown. Also interesting to note is, again, that China versus US if we look at the population versus player, China still has a lot of room to grow. There's a lot more players that would be potentially accessible in there once they perhaps get more, could be related to somewhat internet connection, mobile devices, other hardware, for example. But there's a lot of growth potential in there as well. Right. And just as a final note, yeah, looking forward. So like I mentioned, this is looking at 2020, our numbers, we're looking at a total of 175 billion. We originally projected this at, before COVID, at I think 100, just over 150, 155 or so. So we've seen a really big growth in the overall revenue. We also project that there's going to be a pretty strong growth in the next couple of years as well. Part of that is going to be thanks to perhaps the COVID situation as well. We're hoping to see that there's going to be some stickiness for a lot of these new players, a lot of these people that are getting more used to getting games into their lives. Hopefully, and it looks like there's going to be a pretty high stickiness there. And so that should be hopefully translating into more revenue going forward. All right, so yeah, I guess if there's any questions at this point, just about the key numbers or anything else, feel free to throw them in the chat. I don't know if there's any questions yet, or.
There certainly is, Tyler.
Right.
The first one to come up is, in Newzoo monitoring, do you track AR and VR gaming as well as mobile game controller and PC?
Yeah, so for all of these revenue numbers we're looking at, we are actually taking a top-down approach. So this is based on our market analyst team. They build these models out from top-down perspective. So they're looking at all kinds of data sources, financials from companies, et cetera, and compiling all this together to build out these models. So we do include everything. So if we're talking PC, this should include all related revenues in terms of premium purchases of buying the games to in-game revenues from microtransactions, crossing over to what like VR, AR, like you mentioned. We try to include everything within this modeling.
Okay, so it does include AR and VR if it's console-based or if it's
right.
PC-based. Gotcha.
Right.
Okay. And then I have another interesting question, and I'm not sure if it's more appropriate for later, but I am going to ask it now. It says, I would like to hear from the panel on the state of the nation on monetization. Through advertising or purchase subscription, et cetera, how has 2020 impacted that? And what are the trends for 2021? What are marketers demanding from games to justify advertising investment and support?
Okay. So I think there was two questions in there, if I'm not mistaken. The first was talking about the monetization models, correct?
Yes.
Yeah, I think I will cover this a little bit. I think some of the trends coming up. I think we have seen a lot of the different areas of gaming. I think this is a kind of a longer building up trend, not that it was specifically impacted by COVID or something like that, or 2020, but we've seen a lot more developers um, trying out new things. So from a developer level, I would say like the AAA space, for example, is really adopting all of those like best practices or those techniques from the free-to-play space. So it's getting a lot more universal, I think, for a lot of games. Premium games are completely adopting free-to-play monetization models, whether that be the battle passes, which has become extremely popular, to microtransactions, any kind of cosmetics, etc. I think a lot of the developers and publishers, not just in what was traditionally maybe mobile or PC free-to-play space, I think it's becoming more and more universal. I think 2020 has reinforced that a bit in terms of, I think a lot of companies have been really focusing as games as a service. They found, that as performance has gone up across the board, a lot of companies have noticed that they can really invest heavily into games that were already launched, that are running, and they can actually, by implementing more monetization models and more events for engagement, for example, they can actually create a growing player base or keeping a longer tail in terms of keeping those players and monetizing them. What's also interesting, I'll talk a little bit at the end, is about, I think on the console level, if you look at more of the, the platform or the console level, for example, we're seeing a lot of doubling down, a lot of, no matter if it's Sony with PlayStation or Microsoft with Xbox, a lot of, like, for example, those subscription models, for example, are getting very important to their business model as a whole, in terms of engagement, keeping the players playing, like Xbox Game Pass, but also as a constant revenue stream as well. So I think the overall Battle Pass subscription model, for example, is a really strong example of what's becoming a big norm in the industry as a whole. And there was a second part. Sorry, I can't.
Yeah, great. Thank you. The second part was, what are marketers demanding from games to justify advertising investment and support?
Okay. Yeah, I think I can partially answer that. So for demands, I would say overall, for sure, we've seen that we work with a wide variety of companies, Newzoo. So we have definitely our most clients in the games industry directly, but we work with a lot of companies that are outside the industry that are interested in it. And we work with a ton of different brands, all kinds of different companies, like I mentioned. But yeah, what we've seen is that there's a huge uptick in the understanding of how powerful gaming is in terms of reaching audiences, especially during the kind of quarantine COVID-19 situation. We found that there's a lot more brands that are looking for new ways to advertise or get involved. And especially now, with a lot of the sports not being going on, a lot of other traditional entertainment, traditional entertainment fields not being as active or active at all, that there's been a lot more engagement in terms of getting involved with those, investing in marketing inside of games, for example. Yes, and I think also there's been really strong, successful patterns now in business models. For example, I'll talk a bit about with like Fortnite, for example, and some of these top games have done really well with this IP injection and integrating these kind of like metaverse social events around brands and individuals like celebrities, for example. So I think this business model and this overall relationship, synergy between like marketing and games is just going to grow. I hope that answered the question.
Yeah, I think it certainly did, and I heard a lot of like events, engagement events, and whatnot, which is really great because we've been hearing a lot of the importance of understanding live ops, and that seems to be right aligned with what you said. I just have a question about that Lucy has shot over here, just to clarify definition: in-game revenue that includes advertising revenue.
Yes. So when I mention these models that we're looking at here, we are again, trying to include everything. So in-game revenue, especially for, we're talking about mobile space. If we're talking about a lot of the games now are heavily dependent on like advertising revenue inside. So yes, what we're trying to do here is provide a very holistic, complete look in terms of revenue. So it should include that.
Great. Okay, and another one just came through. Does Newzoo have any reports segmented by, say, studio size? So a AAA versus a AA, a large indie, smaller indie, and do they see the same growth across the board during 2020?
That is a great question. If we're talking about growth in terms of like revenue or player base, I can't think off the top of my head the exact kind of numbers or something like that. We have seen, I guess I could speak kind of broadly to this. As a whole, we have obviously seen that uptick, but there are very specific games, genres, other factors that show different patterns still. Some are going to grow a lot more. We've seen like a shooter genre, kind of the MOBA, what we call battle arena genre, was really taken off, I think. Yeah, there's certain ones that have grown a lot. But I'm sure there's tons of those that would be maybe certain other genres or certain companies that didn't find that same growth. But yeah, we can definitely. What's kind of cool though is we definitely have that data available. We would just have to, if someone's interested in that, they could reach out to us. We could look into this together. We have a lot of data. Like I mentioned, we have our platform. One of the cool things about our platform is we also have a pretty robust taxonomy system. And with this taxonomy system, we can break down all the different games in terms of all the different elements, including the developer, publisher, et cetera. And then we can kind of take all that data related to that and just kind of analyze it. So I don't know if we have it, but we definitely could do it. So hopefully we do that soon.
Fantastic. Thank you. All right. I think that's the questions on board for that section. So
cool. Alrighty. Okay, on to the next section then. So now we're going to be talking a little bit more about the overall trends in the market. Yeah, I think there's a lot of interesting things that have happened this year on its own. Even more so now with COVID. I think that has changed the dynamics a lot. So hopefully we can cover a couple of the most important ones here. The first one was kind of just like what I was just talking a little bit about. I think is the is huge, I guess we can call it like the Metaverse trend, where a lot of these games as a services are evolving into something bigger than they once were. There was always, like we mentioned, just about like advertisers and brands involved with games. But we're really seeing the next step up, and we're really seeing an evolution to that. Taking that Fortnite example, which I think is one of the biggest spearheads to this, Fortnite's Party Royale, for example, really emphasizing these like social events, throwing live concerts in the game. We're seeing this now with Roblox as well. I think this is definitely going to be a huge pattern. There's going to be more and more games leveraging this to, of course, increase their exposure, get more people playing. It's one of those great techniques as well to get a long-term tail, for keeping players engaged, even if they're getting more bored of a game, but now they're actually finding it to be a more social event. So it's becoming something bigger than a game. They're becoming platforms, which is a really important step, I think, to keep that stickiness long term. So this is definitely going to be a big thing coming up, and it's, I think, a pretty interesting trend for everyone, and including the advertisers and marketers as well, and everyone involved. There's a lot of creative stuff going on, and it should only evolve from here. Also talking about live services, this is again another thing we kind of briefly touched on, but we're looking at definitely the premium game, like premium and the AAA space is really trying to learn a lot from what's going on, and we see a lot of great examples. I think not just this year, but the last couple of years, we've seen that some of these top companies that had games that weren't doing so well at the beginning have adopted a lot of cool free-to-play concepts in there. Whether that's monetization, but also in terms of games as a service as a whole, what events they're throwing, what content they're building, how they're interacting with the communities. We're seeing a lot of evolution here, and this space, AAA space, tends to be a bit slower to evolve, and we're seeing that momentum pick up with a lot of success examples. So I think this is obviously just going to, in the next couple of years, just going to keep growing in terms of what these games are going to be trying, what they're going to be learning from the free-to-play space. So should be pretty interesting. And looking at the other end of the spectrum, hyper casual games is another one of those that's been growing over the last couple of years. And I think we've hit a very interesting, I don't know if to call it a peak yet, but it's definitely hitting a very strong point where there's an amazing number of downloads. I just noticed this is slightly older. This is looking at like August. So these numbers should be even higher, of course. But some of the top guys like Voodoo, Lion Studios have had really impressive years. The number of hyper casual games that are coming out these days is just humongous. And there is an interesting crossroads, I believe, where we're seeing that these games, although popular, we're getting to the point where the lifetime value, LTV, and the CPI, the cost per install, is hitting kind of a point where I think it's becoming more and more difficult to advertise these games and to turn a profit. I think that a lot of these studios right now, especially the top publishers like Voodoo, probably looking at how to evolve this. So people are asking what comes after hyper casual. I think there's going to be some attempts to make, one direction could be that they're going to make it more hardcore in terms of making it a little bit more core in terms of the gameplay experience, but also in terms of monetization. We're seeing what was traditionally a advertisement only trend turn to a trend to introduce subscription models again, other in-app purchases. So it's going to be quite interesting to see what comes out of this next, but is extremely popular still, the hyper-casual space. A couple other interesting things to note, and this is the Zynga acquired Rolik this year. Tencent made an investment in Voodoo, some other trends like this. So I think, of course, these companies want this investment, I'm sure, to expand and try to grow even larger. But I think from the other angle, from a Zynga perspective, perhaps this could be an interesting way that they're trying to help transition these players from the hyper-casual space into a more core experience. So I think that's another technique that's going to be tried soon, is getting them funneled from hyper-casual, where it's very low ARPU, for example, into more core games. And I think that that funnel has been used in the past, and it should be quite interesting to see if they can, if that's what will happen, if they can pull it off. Yeah, so another interesting thing is kind of that looking more into the monetization side. This one's quite interesting, I think, where we're seeing a bit of back and forth between not just what I said earlier with AAAs and such, learning more about monetization, free-to-play models, but we're seeing this kind of casual to core and core to casual learning experience. There's a little bit of hybridization here. So we're seeing, like I mentioned, with hyper casual, we're seeing more and more trying to adopt more something like a subscription battle pass modeling. And then the other way around as well, we're seeing in the core games, they're trying to even introduce the in-game ads in some games now. We're seeing even though what was traditionally more premium games, they're trying to introduce more login rewards, events, etc. So we're seeing this kind of cross hybridization between the different core and casual spaces as well. This one I really love. This is talking more about user-generated content, consumers becoming producers, right? They call it prosumers sometimes, and I think this is really cool that I feel like games are finally starting to catch up. If we look at the other industries, there's so much user-generated content out there these days that we take it for granted, from all the social media that's really user-generated content. YouTube, for example, in the video space is humongous now, all user-generated content. And games have always had that core essence in terms of modding games, but we're finally seeing it evolve into like a bigger mainstream concept and something that is even profitable for the creators. So some of the best examples, of course, are Minecraft, Roblox. Roblox is quite interesting, of course. Been around for many, many years, but just announced it's going to IPO. Had huge growth this year. And what's really fantastic, I think, and interesting about their business model is that they are doing something like YouTube, where they're introducing creators are making all the content, but the creators are also making a revenue share, and something like a YouTube. And I think that these kind of business models are really interesting, and these just kind of platforms, they're evolving, games are evolving into platforms. I think this is really fantastic. In terms of for creators and for the gamers themselves. There's so much cool content out there. And I think it's a perfect time now with the streaming communities, etc. It's just, I think this is going to really blow up in the next couple of years. And we're seeing a ton of different games already exploring that. So I think this is a good space to keep looking into. Another interesting one, I also lived in China for 10 years, so this is also another one near and dear to me. But we're seeing a lot of interesting Chinese game companies succeeding abroad. And this has always been, I think, there's been always Chinese game companies that have succeeded in a lot of spaces, especially in mobile in general. But what's cool is that, for example, looking at Call of Duty Mobile, we're seeing like a big step up. We're talking top line production values. We're seeing big cooperation like Call of Duty, of course, with Activision. But we're really seeing that China's finding that footing. I think a lot of these Chinese companies are finding footing in the international market and really exploding. This is, I think what's quite interesting as well to note is that since 2018, there was some interesting government level changes inside of China, of course, related to the government approval process. So you do need a license to launch a game in China. In 2018, there was a big hiccup, big changes going on, and there was actually, I think, 8 months without any new game being able to launch. This caused a big culture change inside of the industry, of course, where people knew that there's huge risk just staying inside of China, which is already a huge market, but is very risky if you can't launch a game. And so we had a huge cultural shift to really focus on the international game markets. And we're seeing that kind of big first wave, I think, this year. But it should continue, especially with some of these big success examples, like Call of Duty Mobile. The most recent, probably Genshin Impact, has had a huge, profound impact on the game community there. I hear so much about it now, looking a lot more into the console space than before, into PC space than before. So I think this is just the start of it, but it's going to be a trend going forward as well. Another one would be the VR. VR is an interesting topic because it's a couple years ago, it was one of the hottest topics, and now recently we hear less and less about it. But if we actually look at the trends here, like we have a graph here of just the overall monthly connected devices, I think this is slightly older data, apologies. But what's interesting is we do see that curve, and that looks like a healthy curve, even though it's not as large as the other areas of gaming. We see that there is definitely strong growth. And what's really cool was this year we saw Half-Life Alyx, for example, getting launched, and it was a really cool kind of first really AAA feeling experience inside of VR. Although there's been really a ton of fantastic experiences like Beat Saber, which has been a hit. We do see developers still seeing that there is support in the development community. Not as committed on the AAA space, but we do see a strong community of developers still working in VR and AR. And with this growth pattern, I think that there's a high chance of growth here, that there's going to keep going. Hopefully we can hit a tipping point where we're going to see a more mass adoption. And I think the technology, the market, everything is coming together now where there's a great opportunity here. Okay, cool. Yeah, I think that is it for this section. So I'm assuming there's probably some questions, Sarah, for me?
Yes, there certainly is. And an interesting one about 5G. How is 5G impacting gaming?
Oh, yeah, that's a great question. I am definitely not an expert on this front, I'll be honest. We do have people internally that are more focused on this. But we have seen, what I have seen personally from the companies that we work with, there's a huge, a lot of the larger companies are looking directly into this, and they're talking to us about this as well. And I think this is going to open up a lot if we have this kind of 5G, we have this speed. Looking at stuff like trends as well that we didn't talk about would be like, I guess, cloud gaming. These kind of things which aren't large yet, but it's just starting. And I think with something like 5G, for example, this technology is really going to open up the doors to these new ways to interact with games. And I think one of the cool things is like on the mobile devices already, we see huge adoption into more core games, for example. Like the PUBGs, all these other more, what was traditionally not a mobile focused game. We're seeing, I think with 5G, for example, if we could start doing something like streaming these types of games, we can do cloud streaming. Anyways, yeah, I don't know enough about this to be super, I'm not predicting anything on this front, but I think there's a lot of potential here with 5G, and I know that's causing a lot of buzz from all the way from the hardware companies to a lot of the top game companies as well looking into this. So yeah, I don't have too many great answers on that one, but I think it's definitely an interesting space and we could look into that.
Yeah, absolutely. And we all know that in just an hour, it's hard to get to everything. So I do encourage people to keep asking questions and to come onto Discord to keep the chat live even after the hour ends, because I know there's going to be lots to discuss. Another question just came in. There's a clear growth in mobile gaming in China, but has there been increased interest in PC consoles as an avenue to reach Chinese markets?
Yeah, that's a great question. We have seen a lot of, so we've seen some of the big players, we have Microsoft, Sony, for example, have, and Nintendo Switch has worked with Tencent, for example. They have all found avenues to actually directly get into the market, and they are actively pushing the console space, for example. They're really pushing hard into there. What is quite difficult, one point I would say for them, their growth, is the one thing I mentioned would be the licensing. So every game that gets launched in China has to get a license from the government. And that approval process includes things like it can't be too violent, or you can't have blood. So sometimes it'll be like green blood they change it into to hit standards. You can't have a skeleton, like if you have like a fantasy game, a skeleton, you would have to reskin it or something like that. So there's a ton of regulations. And so what we found was that after the first couple of years of launching, I think there was I don't want to say offhand, but maybe like 2015 or so was the first big launches. We've seen that there's still not enough games getting in to really get more adoption. But what we see overall is mostly in what they call first tier cities. So the Beijing, Shanghai, the bigger cities with a more disposable income, there is a big presence of that culture and that community there. What most people are doing, though, in terms of console is buying what they call gray market. You can buy a Hong Kong, Japan, etc. version and play it in China, and you can actually download games from the Hong Kong store, Japan store, which is, has all the games available. So there is a big gray market there. Those numbers are tougher to track, though. I would guess in a couple of millions, but I don't know offhand. PC does actually have a really great presence. To switch gears, though, PC as a whole, in terms of their internal market, like Tencent, for example, these companies that have their own platforms or distribute games there, huge communities there, tons of revenue, tons of games there. It's definitely becoming more and more mobile, I think, for the traditional Chinese games, which are maybe more towards like MMORPGs and such. But what's also interesting was since PUBG really spearhead into China, Steam. And Steam is in a really interesting gray market space as well. It's technically allowed to run in China, but none of the games have gone through the licensing process. So theoretically, it could get shut down any day, but there are millions of Chinese players on Steam now, and it's definitely growing in popularity. Since PUBG, now we have more streamers and more people highlighting games in China, and it's definitely spreading. So some of that more Steam-like gaming PC content is still growing pretty fast there.
That is very, very interesting insight and a great segue into the next question. Since you lived in China for 10 years, I'd be curious to hear what you believe are the key differences between Chinese and American gamers in terms of what they're looking for.
Wow. Yeah, that's another big
question.
one. It's a good question. Very good question. Yeah, I think let me try to break this down. I think it is quite interesting. I think there's a lot of very different types of gamers, of course, just like everywhere, in terms of North America, etc. But we have obviously you have the largest chunk are going to be what we would call it Newzoo. We even have like our own segmentation for players, but definitely like the time filler type. So most players are on mobile, for example, or something like that, playing very light games in general. So either Candy Crush type games, casual games. So a lot of them are just, again, trying to fill time up. What we do see, though, is some patterns, for example, are that Chinese gamers tend to be more competitive. So a lot of the especially we'll call them more core gamers, tend to prefer very competitive ways to compete, just ways to compare against each other, really worried about that kind of thing. really interested in not minding at all pay-to-win models. So why MMORPG, the free-to-play, pay-to-win type models are actually very popular there and not discussed as negatively as in with the, I would call it the Western gamers. So yeah, you have a lot more, I would say, time filler, a lot of people that are very dedicated into really getting sucked into a game and just spending a lot of money and time into them. What's also interesting is I think there's a lot more trend chasing in terms of the overall population loves to pick a certain game that's most popular. So when PUBG got popular, it was literally popular across most gamers. So anyone young would have to know about PUBG as a cultural fact, where it might come up in a discussion. And if you don't play PUBG, you're kind of looked down upon. So you tend to find that when a game gets popular there, it gets extremely popular there. So I think that it's a little bit less of these separate niches that we find in the West now, where a lot of players, especially on like a Steam, for example, will find their niche. There still tends to be a much more mainstream couple top games that are really performing well.
Okay.
That's a couple examples.
No, that's wonderful. Is the size of the Chinese market you provided earlier adjusted for the gray market, or is some of the Japanese revenue, for instance, attributed to the Chinese gray market consumers?
Yeah, I'll be honest. It's definitely not going to be perfect. We do know like all the main issues like this gray market thing. We do know them. So we try to adjust in our model to make sure that we adjust to our best of our knowledge. But there's certain things like that that are just extremely hard to track, to be honest. And some of that, yeah, the tracking data, like I mentioned with our platform, we do have data tracking. But we've always known that, for example, the China market, whenever we get data on there, it's always very difficult to parse out what exactly is correct there. It's a very unique market in that case. But yeah, we try to cover for as much of that as possible, and it's definitely in our model.
Okay. And does Newzoo provide access to regionally specific audience segmentation profiling?
Originally, not quite sure.
Regionally specific.
Oh, regional. Oh, sorry. Regionally specific. Yes. So one of the cool things we do have is, like I mentioned, what is called our consumer insights product. With our consumer insights, you can actually see we do our survey we do every year. We have a couple different products actually, but the main one we do is over 60,000 gamers around the world. And what we do is we specifically target, I want to say it's 32 countries now that we cover, and we at least cover 2,000 to 3,000 per market. And what we do with that is we have very extensive questioning in those surveys. And then one of the pieces then is helping us clue into what kind of, we call it gamer, yeah, what kind of gamer persona they are. So within there, we're able to say within this country, or even we can aggregate it to a regional level and say, what are the different type of gamers, and not only just like demographics, but yeah, in terms of playing behavior, viewership, we even cover like what brands they know or which brands they like and are interested in. We try to cover a very wide range of topics to really get an understanding of those different demographics.
Great, thank you. Okay. And I think we're ready to learn more about the impact of COVID.
Alrighty. Yeah, so we have, okay. Great. Yeah, so, okay, going into COVID-19. This is kind of a summary one. I'm actually just going to skip over this for now and go into the details. But one of the big things, of course, like we've already brought up, I'm sure everyone has seen to some degree, is we're seeing just in terms of player engagement and revenues across the board is having a huge impact, just growing. I did mention, of course, this is not universal in terms of which games or even genres maybe are growing at what speed. But as an overall trend, we're definitely seeing huge upticks. Some of the interesting things are even we were looking at in terms of we're talking about surveying and such. What we've seen is a lot of different changes, even in motivations, for example. Some more obvious, I think, would be like, for example, a lot more time to fill. I think there's a slide coming up about that. But obviously, a lot more people have more time to play games. So that means what we've seen as well is for most games, not only is it people playing more often, they're playing for longer sessions. So we see the average daily play time going up pretty much across the board. A lot of that is they have time to fill. Gaming fills that, obviously. Other cool things, though, I think are very interesting are the one is we've seen a growth in terms of socialization, the motivation to play with friends, family, etc. This is obviously also from the inability to meet in person a lot of times. And another cool one, I think, is Animal Crossing. Why we saw such an amazing launch is heavily due to that as well, being able to interact in a social way. But what's also interesting, another motivation that has grown a lot since then has been related to just the need to escape. So we have seen that as well. A lot of longer session games, which also tend to be, perhaps adventure games, RPGs and such, which are great escapism as well. We have seen the growth in those areas, and we've also seen players self-reporting that even that they need to escape. They're stuck in their house every day. So those are some of the highlights from there. But yeah, like I mentioned, there's a lot of other things: longer sessions, longer play time. We'll talk about viewing in a little bit, but yeah, viewership is way up across the board. Couple of highlights there, like Steam breaking records in terms of the number of players. We talked about mobile game revenues growing, so quite impressive. I also mentioned this a little bit earlier about our growth. So we went from our original pre-COVID forecast was 157 billion. Now we're up to about 175 billion. So huge growth. And then breaking that down into different platforms is kind of interesting as well. Like I think I mentioned earlier as well, even PS4 and Xbox One had a big boost from this before the launch of the next gen last month. People were ready to fill that void. Like we were saying, they had time to fill. They wanted something. So PS4, Xbox One, and of course Nintendo Switch as well, which had some great titles to follow up, like Animal Crossing. But we saw all these current generation platforms really getting a boost. Some of the potential negatives, though, was there obviously was some titles that were delayed. So some of the higher anticipated titles were delayed because of the whole COVID impact, which may have hurt sales a bit. But we still seeing as an overall, the revenue has been quite high. I think a lot of other games have replaced that. People are buying other games instead. And there was some supply chain issues in terms of on the publishing side as well, which may have had some impact. For mobile, I mean, the most obvious one as well, I think, is just the lowest barrier to entry. Everyone's got a phone. You got a lot of downtime. So we saw, huge growth in terms of overall player share and then the revenues related to that. One interesting one is the PC cafes. So in certain regions, PC cafes are quite popular still. And we saw that a lot of them are closed, of course. And then with the closing, a lot of players that don't have the hardware to play something like PC or console, they were starting to pick up mobile for the first time, or getting more involved in mobile than they used to be. Another interesting fact was we'll talk a bit about in a sec, but is a lot of the development was impacted. A lot of studios had trouble with COVID, getting used to the remote working. Mobile does have a bit of an advantage with it seems like we've seen from the companies we surveyed and interviewed as well. There's less impact overall, possibly due to the team sizes, the complexity is less, or maybe they're just set up better. But we have seen less impact in terms of development due to that, so that helps new games getting launched still. But one thing that we do want to note is that we do predict that, and we are seeing some of the numbers already, that since there is a lower barrier to entry, there's also no sunk costs. So players tend to, if they bought a new console, for example, they're going to be much more sticky in that space, buying new games, playing it more often. But with mobile, we always have it. It's easy to just drop it when something else comes along or things get back to normal, for example. For the PC space, what is interesting is it's really strong in terms of the streaming community, in terms of esports, which already had a boost, and being in front of that as a PC, we saw some real positive impact in terms of playing on the PC platform. Yeah, and also kind of interesting was there was a temporary bump, I guess, and also in browser gaming as well. Again, maybe people stuck at home, nothing to do, they just jump on their computer. Maybe while they were working, they were secretly browser gaming on the side, which is kind of an interesting, smaller one. Yeah, let me think what else. But yeah, I guess the one would be the PC cafes. Again, if they were closed, there's going to be some impact on there. Yeah, there was more uptake of console we mentioned before because they're cheaper, it's easier to get into. So PC didn't grow as much, because it is more expensive if you want to get a mid to high range PC setup. Just really quickly, like I mentioned before, average daily playtime has definitely been up. What I have seen recently looking through our platforms is that those numbers are going back down, not below what they used to be, but getting closer back to what it was pre-COVID. So even though a lot of people are quarantined still, we're seeing the numbers for a lot of players, a lot of genres I've looked at, they have is starting to go back down to what we would call, I guess, quote unquote normal. I mentioned about motivations. A couple interesting, some of the top games coming out have been very social, streamable. I think it fits really well with the current situation. So I think great games by themselves, of course, but just like Animal Crossing have had a huge boost because of the situation. Streaming and viewership has had a huge uptick. You can see with the chart here, March 2020, number of hours watched has skyrocketed. Esports as a whole, because there's less esports events, a lot of them got canceled, I think we have it about like overall maybe down a little bit or about even, but overall viewership for streaming, etc., is definitely way up. And yeah, I mean, looking at companies across the board, the big companies that have had a really great, comparing first half of the years compared to last year, huge growth almost across the board. One big thing, though, is that, of course, the development side. We saw, I think there's a survey from GDC here where it says 46% of the developers have had a negative impact on development because of this. So this is obviously, while revenues are skyrocketing, there's always a lot of issues that are following a lot of companies now in terms of development, funding, etc. So there's obviously a big impact on that. And yeah, just really quickly, I'll just try to jump into we do see that, for example, next generation consoles, we see that there tends to be, with the launch of a new generation of hardware, there's actually overall a bump, a little bit of a bump in terms of sales, in terms of revenue for the console, but there tends to be a downturn in overall software sales for that short time. You can see in the middle there, the peak of the current generation. That was a couple years later when the hardware is, more established, more people have it, developers are more used to it. So there tends to be a pattern with this, and we expect something similar this time. And just to give you a little sneak peek, we just got the data rolling in. We have November's, which was the first month of PlayStation 5, Xbox Series X and S, and we got some numbers rolling in. So this is the top games since November 15 in terms of the percentage of players playing these games. Astro's Playroom obviously is coming installed with PS5, but those are the other top titles you can see real quick. And then I just get a little sneak peek here. We got green for Xbox and blue for PlayStation. We'll have more numbers coming up soon, but this is just kind of look at the overall split between, the ranking of the top games and then the split between the different consoles so far. So Call of Duty has performed the best. Yeah, you can kind of see this here. It's kind of interesting. So yeah, okay. I think that's hopefully enough, covered most of the topics today. And I don't know, do we have any time for any more questions, or how do we want to wrap this up?
I do not think we do, but
All right.
I have also invited people to Discord to keep asking questions. There's a lot of blue on that slide. Distracted by all the blue. Thank you so much, Tyler, for taking the time to share this with us. It has been incredibly insightful. I also wanted to thank Emma. I know she's not here right now, and your whole team for working with our team, Ontario Creates and CMF, to make this all happen. We are also excited to let everyone know Interactive Ontario has been working with Newzoo to establish a partnership supporting members of Interactive Ontario by offering discounts to access this valuable data. And I'm so excited for that. It's such an important part of business to be able to take this data and use it to meet your goals. So please take an extra minute when filling out the survey that Stephanie will be sending out shortly to answer some of the additional questions about Newzoo Pro. We're looking for feedback on not just are you interested, but what kind of data is going to help you and in what ways. It's easy, multiple choice, easy to do. So please help us to deliver this amazing opportunity as we continue to work with Newzoo to bring this discount to you. Thank you. And thank you for being here. And I hope you all enjoyed.